Hi, I'm Arthur Teasy, CEO of MeaningBot, and today I would like to discuss probably the biggest challenge facing advanced technology companies, and that is bias in artificial intelligence. Today we'll take a look at the steps that can be taken to reduce bias and what MeaningBot is doing to assess, monitor, and reduce bias in our products. We'll start by describing what bias is, how bias appears in humans versus how it appears within AI, and how it seeps into AI math and data, the impacts it has on us, how we define fairness as compared to bias, and the supporting research that can help us address and resolve bias. More than 180 human biases have been defined and classified, any one of which can affect how we make decisions. Biases find their ways into the AI systems that we design that are used to make decisions by many, from governments to businesses. Bad data used to train AI can contain implicit racial, gender, and ideological biases. With all of this in mind, let's dive into the discussion about how bias is defined, how we can control it, and what steps MeaningBot is taking to control bias in our AI systems. So what is bias? Bias is a prejudice, either in favor of or against a thing, person, or a group. We naturally have inclinations to either favor the presence or absence of some of the characteristics. So for instance, the presence of sharp claws on the limbs of a wild animal would suggest that we should run away from the animal as quickly as possible. And this suggests that we have a prejudice against wild animals with sharp claws, and in fact, this bias protected our ancestors from falling prey to many lethal wild creatures. But the term bias is often used in a context where the prejudice is unfair, and it can create a paradox of sorts at times. Some biases are critical to our survival, but that is certainly not to say that all biases are fair. General examples of biases include bias around cognition, statistics, context, gender, race, age, and others. The bias I mentioned, which tells us to run away from wild creatures with sharp claws, is an example of cognitive bias. In the past, cognitive biases were critical for our ancestors, and even today are useful in some cases, and that's because they're a faster way of implicitly reducing risk as compared to thinking through any situation rationally. These kinds of life-threatening situations occurred more often in the life of our ancestors than they occur in our lives today, and yet many forms of cognitive bias remain today. Obviously, all biases are not created equal. Some are critical for survival, while some ruin lives. Biases such as gender bias and racial bias are unfair, and they have a huge impact on the lives of the people affected by them. They reinforce negative feelings toward the people, teams, companies, or governments that share them, although often these biases are not consciously generated. Human bias in general is difficult to understand and identify, and that's because a large part of human decision-making takes place in our subconscious. AI systems are augmenting and sometimes replacing humans in many application domains, and so there are many places where human bias can affect processes. Scientists have and will continue to be more cautious about AI systems being biased than humans because of the scale, the large data sets, and the capacity of these algorithms. So as a result, AI systems are screened far more rigorously than human decision makers in these domains. According to the law of large numbers, we begin to see trends of bias as the size of the population grows. Let's take the case of medical school admissions as a good example of this. A medical school in London decided to deploy an algorithm to decide which applicants would be invited for interviews. The system was found to be biased against women and applicants with non-European names. However, the system was developed based on training data of prior humans. And even with the biased algorithm, this medical school ended up admitting more non-European students as compared to most of the other medical schools that did not rely on an algorithm. The irony was that humans were more biased in this case than the flawed algorithm. Although this is certainly not something we should holistically support when it comes to AI and bias, better than worse is not clearly the goal. It's often said that identifying the problem is the first step toward solving it. AI can be critically helpful in making our biases more apparent to us and, hence, prompt us to make appropriate action to mitigate bias. In fact, AI rigor can actually help identify undesired and unintended human biases. Bias in an AI system can be defined as unfair discrimination against or in favor of some group, and this usually happens due to an inappropriate use of certain characteristics which are not causal, but show correlations. While causation and correlation can exist at the same time, correlation does not imply causation. Causation explicitly applies to cases where action A causes outcome B. On the other hand, correlation is simply a relationship. Action A relates to action B, but one event doesn't necessarily cause the other to happen. Correlation and causation are often confused because the human mind likes to find patterns even when they do not exist. We often fabricate these patterns when two variables appear to be so closely associated that one is dependent on the other. The difference between correlation and causation is apparent in a lot of events. So, for example, in the last few decades, per capita soda consumption has increased, and so has life expectancy. But inferring that the increase in soda consumption caused an increase in life expectancy would not be valid. This is a classic example of mistaking correlation for causation. If you train a classifier to predict life expectancy and it learns correlation with an increase in soda consumption as opposed to other causations such as an increase in healthcare availability or preventative care, the classifier might perform well on test data, but when it's applied over a length of time, it will definitely fail to capture accurate causation. Anytime we use the wrong features to derive outcomes, whether they be specific data, the choice of math approach, or the specific type of data, it results in a biased algorithm. Sometimes features are outright wrong and irrelevant, and sometimes they're deemed unacceptable by societal, professional, and legal systems. Although the AI system is arriving at accurate results in a controlled training environment, it's important to look at the path to this decision-making to ensure minimal bias in the algorithm. Defining what counts as bias in technical terms still remains a challenge. Bias and fairness are context-dependent terms. Detecting bias at a large scale in AI systems is actually more accomplishable compared to detecting bias in human decision-making. With the growing availability of explainable AI, AI decision processes are getting more and more trackable. And that is a good thing because this allows us to analyze the features AI is used to arrive at a final decision. Again, human decision-making is not 100% conscious thinking. As research in AI grows, AI systems are finding their application in many critical domains, and the number of people engaging and interacting with AI is increasing exponentially. AI systems today have a vast impact on things like healthcare, economics, banking, credit, public policy, recruiting, and lots of other areas. And all of these same areas are also suffering from sustained human bias. So, for example, there's a lot of unconscious bias in hiring. I mean, did you know that a person named Jose has a significantly lesser chance of being hired than a person named Joseph? This type of bias can lead to a lack of diversity, early and high employee turnover, cultural deterioration, enterprise adverse impact to protected classes, and significant company financial risk. AI has the unfortunate potential to bake in and scale these implicit biases. Bias has recently been found in systems deployed for facial and object recognition, hiring programs, web searches, and others. It's critical. It's really critical to be diligent, to be on a lookout for existing and potential bias in AI systems. This will help preserve the utility, the trust, and the longevity of these systems. Bias has a number of entry points where it can seep into AI systems. The most common source by far of bias is in the data you train the algorithm on. If data is not diverse, AI algorithms pick up patterns and in turn become biased. It's not always that the lack of data diversity is intentional. Let's take a classic example. You plan to train a classifier algorithm which classifies dogs versus cats. You go to the internet and you find pictures of dogs and cats to train the algorithm. You're aware of the bias, and so you collect images of many breeds, different colors, etc. But you miss looking at the parameter of size. Most of the images of the dogs are bigger than images of cats, so the classifier learns to predict dog versus cat based on the size of the animal in the image, rather than learning actual features that differentiate cats from dogs. This happens because your classifier is tasked to learn to predict as accurately as possible based entirely on the training data set that you provided. It isn't aware of which features are unacceptable to be used, so it latches on to the easiest one and finishes the task. This can result in an algorithm biased against small dogs. Bias in an algorithm itself can cause the outputs to be biased as well. The way features are built and which features are given importance in final decision-making have serious consequences on the fairness of any system. Imagine an application trained to spot airplanes in any given photograph. You train the algorithm to spot airplanes with a data set of images which had more pictures of planes in the sky than pictures of planes on the land. Well, the algorithm would then learn to give more importance to the features representing sky than actual airplane features while making predictions. This might lead to poor performance on images of planes on the ground. In addition to adding more data, it would be worthwhile to look into feature importance measures to reduce this type of bias. Adding more data is not always possible. Sometimes data points are expensive, or they're unavailable, or it's really time-consuming to obtain. And so tweaking algorithms helps reduce the bias of the system. AI systems are largely dependent on their human counterparts still, for training purposes. Implicit bias in humans can sometimes seep into AI systems because of these dependencies. A good example would be a natural language processing system, NLP for short, trained on, for example, news articles. It will learn the correct relationships between various words and embed their meaning. But, along with this meaning absorption, it will also learn unfair and unwanted stereotypes present in the language. Fairness in the context of bias is the term which can be considered as an antonym of bias. Similar to bias, fairness is a subjective and a continuous term. And by that we mean that rather than being fair or unfair, some systems cut across and sit on a spectrum of fairness. According to computer scientist and Princeton professor Arvind Narayanan, there are 21 definitions of fairness, and some of them contradict each other when taken out of context. And so because of this, completely fair systems are really difficult to achieve. They usually end up breaking the criterion of one or other of the definitions of fairness. If a model conforms to many of the group fairness metrics, it can potentially create trade-offs with individual fairness measures. In some cases, the model can actually lose its utility, and this doesn't suggest that we should deploy biased systems. It's meant to point out that the difficulties in creating quote-unquote fair systems are significant. What we've talked about with respect to fairness is theory-based. Translating these theoretical definitions into technical terms is another complicated challenge in obtaining system fairness. Context is critical to all definitions of fairness, and it's important that context is translated properly while developing fair AI systems. From the fairness graph shown here, it's apparent that a lot of research is being done toward finding the solution for this problem. We have a hope of fair, accurate, and efficient AI systems in the future, and part of this comes from rigorous analysis of outcomes. As an example, the use of adverse impact analysis from data that goes into hiring, managing, and retaining people at a company. In the context of business employment decisions, an adverse impact refers to a disparity in selection for hiring or promotion that disadvantages individuals of a particular race, ethnicity, or sex. So how do we limit bias in these capable AI systems applied on a scale in various application domains, having effect on a mass human population? This is an interesting as well as very challenging question. Increasing diversity in the data used for training is the first thing that comes to mind. More often than not, data is the source of the problem. Being mindful while creating data training sets, looking for the features that can possibly lead to bias, and normalizing them provides significant help in the fairness of the system. Enforcing fairness constraints along with other measures helps in reducing the effect of bias features on final outcomes. Counterfactual fairness is also a really good way of checking the presence of bias. In counterfactual fairness, we find a data point with a sensitive feature and then we reverse it. So an example would be, while looking for gender bias in, for example, a recruiting system, altering the gender of one of the applicants and keeping all the other data constant should lead to a similar or fair outcome. Counterfactual fairness doesn't guarantee the system fairness in every metric, in every context, but it can be a good measure to start with. Using adversary data points while training and testing the system can help reduce the system's reliance on sensitive traits. It also helps prepare the system for real-world challenges and complexities that are usually absent in the control training environment. In the past, we've talked intensively about the need for explainable AI. The research improvements in this allied AI issue will be tremendously helpful in tracking down bias in AI systems. Although the research toward making AI explainable and fair is growing, the need for human judgment is still a significant piece of what's required. Statistical and other technical measures require an addition of situational context to assess the situation. MeaningBot's consistently focused on ensuring that we generate unbiased models. In order to accomplish that, we take a variety of steps, including us ensuring that we're using training data that's rich in diversity with respect to all the various demographics, particularly those that are focused on a 4/5 adverse impact study. We perform frequent adverse impact studies on the pool of applicants of our clients, and we strongly recommend that this be done annually. This addresses bias in the algorithms and the hiring practices of our clients. And part of that is to make sure that our clients have the appropriate information available for analysis. We also have to go out and we find the best third-party companies to perform independent bias audits. This is a critical component for any company that's applying AI at scale. And lastly, we double validate the results in our user feedback, and we incorporate that information into the future training of models. As a more technical term, this is referred to as reinforcement learning of bias control. The MeaningBot team supports and promotes explainable, open, and fair AI systems, not only in the fields of human capital, behavior, and risks, but all the other applications of AI. If you have any questions or you'd like to dive into this exciting research area, we have a bunch of reference materials on MeaningBot's website. So go to www.meaningbot.com/reference. Follow us on LinkedIn and YouTube, or send an email to theteam@meaningbot.com. Thanks a lot.